Hey, you guys, it's Miss Shapiro again. Here to help you with FRQ number 2. Maybe you've seen a couple of my other content videos. Maybe you've seen my FRQ number 1. My one, like, oh, my eye looks weird in the videos. Does it look weird to you guys? Like, maybe I need to, like, I don't know. This one looks smaller in my videos. I was watching them. Okay, anyway, and I say a lot. I'm really sorry. I'm working on it, but it's not going well. So there you go. So this video is on FRQ number 2. We will be going over the components of that. Some of it's going to be the same as FRQ number 1, so if you wanted to like just move ahead a little bit, you could do that. But if you haven't seen FRQ number 1, go ahead and watch this in its entirety. Some of it's the same, but not just maybe like the first section. So let me pull up my screen here. And I'm going to move this to the bottom. That way you guys can still see my face. And my computer's got the, I love my computer, but the camera's kind of like at the bottom, and so it like has this awkward angle, so just apologies. There's the thing. Okay. So let's go ahead and get started. So our objectives for today are to review the science practices necessary for the exam, to review the format of the exam, key components of FRQ number 2, and then any specific content that we may have. Just as a reminder that there is a viewing guide available to you, so hopefully you can download that. I have mine pulled up. I'm also going to, again, start a timer just so that we can, or I can know about how long we've been here. I don't want to hold you guys to too long, about 45 minutes, if not a little bit less. So if you have your viewing guide pulled up, we're ready to go. If not, please pause and find that, and then we will get started. So there are 7 science practices, and that's the first question of your viewing guide. So if you're going to go ahead and pause, you can do a little note-taking here. The first one is about concept explanation. So this is just explaining how something occurs. So maybe you're explaining how the process of photochemical smog formation. Maybe you're explaining how acid rain forms. You're explaining how plate tectonics move, or you're explaining the components of watersheds. So all of those are things that you are going to be required to know for your exam, and so you can see that content explanation is some of the skills. Some of them want you to just basically describe it. Some of you want you to explain it, where we're making some higher level connections. Next up is visual representations. Visual representations are typically things like maps or figures, maybe a map of winds or a figure of how winds form. It could be a population pyramid. It could be plate tectonics, a visual. It could be something in air pollution that shows you the formation of photochemical smog, and it shows you primary pollutants and secondary pollutants. So all of those are considered to be visual representations. They're not data tables or graphs. We're going to talk about those in a minute. Science practice number 3 is a text analysis. This is going to ask you to identify an author's claim, to perspectives, recognize if he's biased. Those things are only assessed in the multiple choice questions. So if you're taking this exam in 2020, there is no multiple choice portion of the exam, and therefore that will not be a science practice that's assessed for you. But if you're taking this at another time, it absolutely will be a part of your multiple choice question. Maybe I say a lot too. Ugh, I'm the worst. Science practice 4 is scientific experiments. And so this is going to ask you, we talked a lot about this in FRQ number 1. It's going to ask you components, an independent variable, dependent variable. If you don't know what those are, stop, go back and see me on the other video and we can talk more about it. But that's a pretty big science practice. The last 3 are data analysis. So data analysis is data tables and graphs, identifying trends, this increase, this decrease. We saw that in energy availability declined from one area to a second area, etc. Mathematical routines are math. If you're taking this in 2020, you do not have a math portion on your exam, but at later dates you will. This is FRQ number 3, so if that's something that you're responsible for, you're going to want to make sure to review math. Remember that the math can appear in both the multiple choice or the free response. Just because you have a calculator, and you are allowed to use one on the AP Environmental Science exam, doesn't mean that the math is going to be easy. If you can't set up the problem, it doesn't do you a lot of good to have a calculator. Okay, and then the very last one is science practice 7. This one is heavily focused on in FRQ number 2. This is going to ask us to provide solutions. So maybe these environmental problems are things such as deforestation or a growing human population or a decline in birth rate. Maybe the problems include things like an invasive species or an endangered species. So those are environmental problems. So A and B just ask you about describing the environmental problems, whereas E and F, we're going to talk about in just a minute, and require a little bit more higher level thinking. What we see that is in question number 2, they're going to ask us to analyze an environmental problem and propose a solution. An authentic environmental scenario is presented and will include a model or quantitative data. So again, we're going to see that visual representations 2, or science practice 2, or we're going to see science practice 5. It's going to ask you to explain the process, analyze the visual representations of data. So in this one, there probably almost always will be a graph or a data table, and then propose or justify some particular problems. And so, I'm sorry, propose solutions to identified problems. So if we take a look again, we're going to see science practice 1 and science practice 2 hit pretty heavily. We went over these already in our previous video, but they're very straightforward. Describe how energy flows. Describe irrigation and the 4 types of irrigation practices. Describe the steps of mining, okay? Not the individual steps, but you know, that a natural resource is extracted and that extraction causes habitat destruction. Okay, so just explaining a concept. The visual representation is from a figure. I'm really sorry. That figure may also be present in question 2, or it could be more of a science practice 5 where we're going to see some type of data. And then we're also going to see 7, and I talked a little bit about 7. So remember that we want to be able to say, okay, if the environmental problem is X, then Y and Z are the solutions, and Z is the best solution, and here's why. So for example, if your environmental problem is eutrophication, which is where too much fertilizer runs off into the water, that's an environmental problem. We have a couple of solutions. We can just wait it out. We can educate farmers. We can aerate or pump oxygen into dead zones. Okay, so those are 3 possible solutions. The advantages of waiting it out is we're not going to put anything else into the ecosystem. Disadvantages, it's going to take a lot of time. An advantage to educating farmers is that we're preventing the problem to begin with, but a disadvantage is that it can be, you know, you're relying on people to change their behavior, which is very hard. Maybe you want to include some taxes or some tax subsidies, and that would be part of that education component, and that's allowed. Or we want to aerate or add oxygen to lakes. The disadvantage of that is it's expensive. It's not pretty realistic if you have a large area. It doesn't fix the problem long term. So I've identified all of my different solutions. Then I've done 7.C. I've described advantages and disadvantages. Maybe I have some data on how oxygenating a lake works over time. And then E and F is going to say, you know what, of my 3 solutions, that 2, educating farmers and taxing people that use fertilizers before rain, not taxing, but penalizing people that fertilize right before rains, and giving a subsidy to people that don't fertilize or don't purchase fertilizers is definitely the best one, right? Because it fixes the root cause of the problem, it helps with education, and therefore it is the best solution. So I have made a claim about which one is best, and then I've provided a justification for that. And so E and F are the most important components of that. So I'll give you a minute to kind of pause here and catch up on your viewing guide if there's anything that you need to do. Okay, so there are 4 main topics of this particular exam. The first one is energy transfer. So this has to do with photosynthesis, respiration, the cycles, all transfer energy and matter, as well as the movements between the tropic levels. You could talk about energy transfer from the sun. You could talk about energy transfer in terms of light or wind. So those are all components of big idea. So think units 1, 2, and 4. Big idea number 2 is the interactions between Earth systems. So this is units 4 and 5. So we're talking about things like ocean currents and ocean patterns. How does that relate to biomes, those kind of things. And then once we're in the biome, how are the species interacting with one another and with their environment? And that's big idea number 3. We see that sustainability is big idea number 4, and that really has to do with later units, 7, 8, and 9. So what are some of the problems that come from when species, specifically humans, interact with their environment, and what are some of the changes that we can make in order to make our activities more sustainable? So maybe things like we're going to decrease our fossil fuel consumption and we're going to increase our renewable resources. We're not going to take out fossil fuels altogether, but we're going to shift to natural gas and then utilizing wind and solar as well. Okay. So remember that when we're writing our exams, and you can write these pointers to the right of that little task verb box that is there in your viewing guide. We want to be concise and to the point. We don't want to draw out extra sentences. We want to make sure that we are, if it says identify, we're only writing one sentence, so concise. You want to write as much as necessary, but as little as possible. So keep that in mind during your FRQs. These are timed. You should have about 20 minutes for each FRQ, although if you're watching this in 2020, you have one that's 25 and one that's 15. Only ask for what, or only give what it asks for. So for example, if it asks for 2 solutions, you're only going to give 2. If you only give 1, you're not going to earn full credit. If you give 3, you're not going to get any credit for that third one, and you've now wasted time. If your first one is right, your second one is wrong, and then your third one is right, you still will not get credit. Even though you have 2, because the second thing that you wrote was wrong, there's no credit that's going to be awarded. And then don't assume that we know what you mean. If it's in your head, you need to put it down on your paper. Avoid pronouns. Well, it causes. Well, if we're not really sure what it is, then we're not going to be able to give you any points. So just make sure that you're specific, that you're concise, that you put down what's in your head. So for example, if you can ask yourself, well, why, or how does that work, or what does that impact, you want to go ahead and include it on your paper. We cannot grade what's in your mind. You're going to think, oh, she knows what I'm talking about, but I probably don't know what you're talking about. You're probably like the 18th million essay that I've graded, and it's like Friday night in the afternoon, and like, I want to go home. So if you made it clear on your paper, I'm going to love you. I'm going to do check, 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 check. But if you don't lay it all out like that, I'm going to be like, sorry, no go. And I will not be able to award any points for that. So just kind of keep those things in mind. And yes, I'm grading your FRQs, so just write me a little note. Hey, Ms. Shapiro. Actually, don't put my name on it. They'll just block it out. But think of me, draw a little picture to the reader that's grading yours. We appreciate things like that. There's that darn again. Okay, so here are those task verbs that I referenced previously. And so describe just means to provide relative characteristic on a topic. So I like to think about describe as to make some type of statement or definition and to give an example. That will almost always earn you a describe point. This can be more than one sentence, but it doesn't really need to be. So do not write more just because you think you need to fulfill a sentence requirement. That is not the case. Okay? Explain is probably the most complex of all of the trigger verbs. Explain means that we need to make connections. A causes B. B causes C. A and C are related in this capacity. This typically tells me how or why or even what, okay? You may see it phrased as give one reason or provide one reason, okay? Oh, I'm super tired. I don't know why. Okay. Identify, this is just a one statement. Identify one cause of deforestation, and you might put one cause of deforestation is human population growth. Okay, it's one sentence, one complete thought. If you just write down a word, they may not give you credit, but all you need to do is just that one complete sentence. Okay, it's very straightforward. Be concise. Justify is asking us to provide evidence. Typically, if it asks us for evidence, we're looking for numbers, okay? So we saw a percent change of X. It increased from 100 to 250. Usually, that is going to be pretty straightforward. But if you see anything that says evidence, we want to make sure that we're including numbers. A justification is like the why. Why is this the best one? Why does that happen, okay? So it's a little bit more, it's more closely related to explain than it is to identify. Maybe like defend your argument would be a good way to think about justify. So why is this one the best one? A claim, again, is very straightforward. It's very similar to an identify. This increased, this decreased. This has bias. This is not appropriate, and here's why. And then propose a solution we talked about is a little bit about, here's what you should do to fix the problem, and here's why you should do this to fix the problem. Make sure that you've listed any advantages and disadvantages of your solution, and why the advantages thus outweigh the disadvantages. All right, so let's get into the nitty gritty of FRQ number 2. So FRQ number 2 is going to have a graph. On the AP Environmental Science exam, you are not ever going to be asked to graph. Okay, so we're not going to have to make the graph in 2020, but you are going to have to analyze graphs. And so we're going to use the acronym dry mix. So dry mix helps us remember how the variables are plotted on the graphs. It serves as a reminder that there are 2 names for each variable, because the scientists can't get their poop in a group and they can't agree, okay? So we have the dry is dependent variable. We also call this the responding variable. Remember that dependent is what changes as a result of me. So how high did the plants grow? How long did it take for something to show adverse effects? So that's the dependent variable. It's also called the responding variable, and it goes on the y-axis. A manipulated variable is the same thing as the independent variable, and it goes on the x-axis. Remember, I for independent, it's what I am going to change, okay? And so you can record this either to the right of your, oh no, I'm sorry, I gave you a whole spot. So we're gonna make sure that we pause the video, we write out what dry mix stands for, and that we're clear. Maybe draw a little, let me see if I can, ooh, I think I can even, dun, 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 fancy, we're gonna annotate. I want my color to be red. So maybe on your paper, we're gonna draw, right? Here's my x-axis and my y-axis. I almost got them mixed up, even your teachers make mistakes. Here's my independent variable. Here's my dependent variable. Or sometimes you might also see time. Time is sometimes your independent variable. But if you're looking at anything, ooh, that's awful. If you're looking at anything over time, time always goes on the x-axis, and we're always going to have a line graph, okay? So hopefully that's something that you can write down on your little viewing guide. And I say a lot. Ugh. And is something that you will can remember on your AP exam. Okay, so moving right along, this is an example of what you're going to see. So this is a question, I think it was from 2015, 2016, and so that says, the graph below shows the relationship between population density and petroleum use in selected cities. Describe the relationship between population density and petroleum use shown in the graph. And so here we have a graph. And so I would highly encourage you right now to pause this video and to kind of take a look at the graph and what it's telling us. Okay, so what we see here is that we have density, or people per hectare on the bottom, and then we have amount of per capita petroleum use. So if we did this investigation, right, it's not really an experiment, but we're looking at a natural phenomenon. So the thing that we looked at was the density. And what changed as a result of the density, remember the density is how many people are in a specific area, was how much petroleum they used. So for example, Houston, if you're not from Texas, or you've never been to Texas, I'm from Texas, so woo-hoo. Houston is a super, super spread out city. It takes you about an hour and a half to drive from like the north end to the south end, I'm sorry, from the north end to like the south end towards Galveston. So it's very, very, very spread out. Maybe some of you guys have been to Los Angeles, and it is also very spread out. If you've ever been to New York, right, what we see about New York is, oh, it's not even on here. Oh yeah, here it is. That its density is way more than Houston, right? But it's not nearly as populated or as dense as places like Tokyo or Hong Kong. And remember that those places tend to have that vertical growth. That's when we grow upwards. So we live in really tall apartment buildings. Maybe we have smart growth. And so there's businesses down below. People live in apartments on the top. There's mass public transportation that takes us everywhere we need to go. Some of this, like London, Vienna, and Paris, they didn't purposefully decide, okay, well, we're going to do vertical growth. This has to do with the fact that a lot of these cities developed in the 1800s and 1900s, and that's just how they lived. They lived in small areas. It's the really old places. Whereas the United States really developed, especially suburban United States, developed after really the 40s and 50s, and we saw our population started to increase, and we had space to move outwards. The car was already invented, and so they could spread outwards. But just some things to keep in mind. But if Hong Kong is very, very, very densely populated, probably one of the most densely populated areas. And so what we see is because these people are all very close to things, they don't need to drive around. It's very expensive to have cars in those areas. They don't drive around a whole lot. And so that their per capita use is very low. Whereas Houston people, LA people, all they do is drive around. And so their per capita petroleum is very, very high. So the first thing I would encourage you guys to do on FRQ number 2 is to just make some observations, make some tracks, claims about your graph. Don't even look at the questions, just kind of cover them up and then record, okay, this is what I think the graph is telling me. So this one says, it says to make sure that we describe the relationship between population, my thing is in the way. Population density and petroleum use as shown in the graph. And so we kind of talked a lot about that. Here were acceptable answers. I'm going to move this just briefly. You can still see me. Hey. This one says petroleum use is inversely proportional. So as population density increases, that petroleum use decreased. And so we see them in the bottom corner here. Petroleum use increases as the density decreases. So this is the opposite way. As my density went this way, my petroleum use tended to go up. You could have just point blank said that they're inversely related, or that there is a negative relationship. So any of those were acceptable. So if you have any questions, I would encourage you to pause the video right now, record your questions, and then ask them to your teacher at a later date. Okay, so this is just kind of a way for us to frame how we might think about our FRQs. Okay, so again, I'm going to move this little box out of the way. Okay, so the first thing when approaching a graph that's on an FRQ, we want to think about this in a couple of specific steps. So the first thing we're going to ask ourselves is what's on the y-axis? And I know that this is pretty small, but I tried to include this in your viewing guide. So if you want to go ahead and pull that back up, it's a little bit larger. Hopefully you can increase it on the screen. So if we look on our y-axis, we're going to see that there's emissions, okay? And we can write that on our, so here's emissions. So we're going to record what's on the y-axis. Well, emissions. So it's like how much car exhaust is coming out, okay? The title tells us about carbon monoxide. All right, so I don't know a whole lot else, but I know that it talks to us about carbon monoxide. And then the x-axis is, this looks like time. So given what we wrote above, what's our graph about? Well, this must be how carbon monoxide emissions, what cars are giving off. It's got a little picture of a car that helps me. So how cars are giving off carbon monoxide, how much carbon monoxide each car must be given off over time. And then if I looked closer on my y-axis, this actually says millions. It says million short tons. So it's probably not individual cars. I was probably wrong on my first glance. But this is how much millions of carbon monoxide was given off by all cars, probably in the United States, starting from 1940 and going into about 2000. It appears, okay? So don't be afraid. You have to look at the units. Looking at the units is probably the most important thing you can do when looking at the axes, okay? So given what I wrote above, what's my graph about? Carbon monoxide emissions in the United States or in a specific country over time. And if we look, my next box asks me, does the data increase or does it decrease? And so I can look at it and say, oh, well, these lines are going up, so it's going to increase. Oh, up until a specific point. That point is 1970. And then overall, it starts to decline. We see that this green line peaks a little bit, but that it starts to go down, okay? And so that's my data. So does my data increase? Well, it increases at first, up into 1970, and then after 1970 it starts to decline. Remember that it's important that you cover all of the graphs. So you couldn't just say it increases or it decreases. We don't know. Which portions are you talking about? Be specific. So it increases until 1970, and then from 1970 it goes down. Now I want you to think for a minute. Given what you know about apes, what could cause that carbon monoxide to go down? So I'm encouraging you to record that in your video right now, or if you need to, pause your video and look this up. I'll give you just a minute. Okay, so maybe you're thinking like, ooh, air pollution, ooh, there's that legislation. Oh yeah, how do we get things to change? Usually we're gonna legislate them. And so we saw that in 1970, the Clean Air Act started to be put into place around that time. And so we saw really, really high levels. So that's probably what caused the Clean Air Act. And then we saw that those levels started to decline. And so we would put something in this box like the Clean Air Act was passed that regulated carbon monoxide level emissions from cars. Now we want to bring everything together. And so my CER statement, remember that CER stands for claim, evidence, and reasoning. So my claim is that from 1970 to 2000, carbon monoxide emissions have declined from 125 million short tons to about 90 million short tons. You need to use numbers in your claim and in your evidence, but AP exam always kind of accepts a little bit of a range. So if you don't get it spot on, usually you'll be pretty close in that range. So my claim is that carbon monoxide emissions declined. In 1970, they were at 125 million short tons. In 2000, they were at maybe 95 or 90 million short tons. So that's my claim that they decreased. That's my evidence, the numbers. My reasoning. In 1970, the United States legislature passed the Clean Air Act that regulated 6 criteria components, criteria emissions. Carbon monoxide was one of those emissions. So since cars couldn't release as much carbon monoxide, they were regulated, and people were fined if they didn't meet the regulations, and car manufacturers started to develop cars that did meet it. The overall amount of carbon monoxide decreased. Okay, so remember that your reasoning is an explain. It's got to make connections. How does what you're saying, how does the legislation component relate back to the claim that it decreased? Okay, so I'll give you a minute, maybe rewind a few minutes and watch this over again, but this would kind of be your approach. So start with your axes, start with your titles, start with the trend of the data, then move into why, and then bring it all together. Okay, so we're going to go through a couple of example graphs. So I think we have 3 examples on ours, and then we maybe can, I think from that we will finish up. Let me see exactly what we have going on. I'll give you a minute to look over the graph. Remember, I want you to make a claim about this graph and provide evidence. So what are my axes? I'm not asking for justification at this point, just a claim and evidence. So just a statement about the trends and some numbers to support that. So the first claim that I might make is that there is more, so first off, I want to back up. So let's look at my axes. So this one is energy, and this one is, oh, this looks to me like types of consumers. And so what I'm going to see is that, oh, my claim could be something super simple. There is more energy in primary consumers than there are in tertiary consumers. Don't make this harder. KISS, keep it simple. You're not stupid, but keep it simple, sweetie. Okay, so we want to make sure that they're going to give you some what we call low-hanging fruit, so some easy points. So that's easy. There's more energy in primary producers than there are in tertiary consumers. Primary consumers produce over 20,000 kilocalories per meter squared per year, whereas apex consumers only have about 1 kilocalorie per meter squared per year. Now, my second part asks me to justify my claim with reasoning. Anytime you see a justification or explain or a reasoning, now we need to think science. Okay, so what's the science behind this? So the science says that, oh, energy decreases as we move through the tropic levels. Okay, we're on the right track. It's probably not enough to earn us that point. Why does it decrease? Oh, because energy is neither created or it's neither created or destroyed, it's just transferred, and that transfer is not efficient because entropy has to increase. So again, we're going to go back to that unit 1 data there, okay? So you have to know the science, but that doesn't mean that just because you have the graph, you don't have to know the APES concepts, okay? So again, my claim, primary producers contain the most energy, tertiary consumers contain the least. Primary contains 20,000, while tertiary contain just 1. Due to the laws of thermodynamics, energy is lost at each tropic level. Ooh, let me move this out of the way. Energy is lost at each tropic level. So if the energy is made in the producers, only 10% moves on to the consumers. So as you move up between the consumers, more and more is lost. I probably should add another sentence. More and more is lost as you move between the consumers, and eventually it will start to run out. That's also why we don't have any like quaternary consumers. The ocean sometimes has quaternary consumers just because it's so vast. There's so much energy, but most food chains and food webs do not. Let's take a look at another example. I'll give you a few minutes to look over the graph because this one's a little bit harder, I think. Okay, so this one asks us to justify the use of windbreaks as a means of increasing crop yield. I'm going to take a look at this and I'm going to be like, I got nothing. I have no idea what's happening in this particular graph. So let's go through our steps. Okay, so first off, I'm going to look at my x-axis. Okay, I have a little legend here. It says H equals tree height. Okay, so I have different tree heights. Okay, that doesn't really help me. Let's look at my Y. Well, I don't really have a Y-axis. I got some arrows. I got this tree, but then I do have these green blocks. Okay, these green blocks at the top. So I'm going to look up here, and this is gain. So this is how much more yield we gain from tree heights. And then my problem also helps me. It does say stuff about windbreaks. Okay, so I'm understanding a little bit more. And now let's look at the title. The title says corn and soybeans. So I have 2 different crops. I used a windbreak. Here's a picture of a tree. Remember that a windbreak is when, maybe you've also heard of agroforestry or alley cropping. This is when we're going to plant trees around the edges of our fields. It does 2 things. One, it helps prevent soil erosion because these trees are big, they block the wind. Remember that wind is a main cause of soil erosion. So if the trees are there, they block the wind, there's not as much wind to erode away my soil, and my soil erosion declines. 2, not really pictured in this, but just so that you know, and we're covering some content, birds live in trees. What do birds eat? Birds eat insects. What eats crops? Insects. So they're also a component of an IPM or an integrated pest management technique. Okay, so let's go back. I'm still looking. So I've got these tree heights. So here must be the height of the trees. And then here is how much we gained depending on how high the windbreak was. Okay, and I can see that it's higher in corn than it is in soybean. And the last thing I want to do is I want to read the little description. It says each bar represents yield average. So that's the yellow part. As studied by someplace, yields increased on the downside of the windbreak. So after the trees, they decreased over distances up to 12 times the height of the windbreak. So that just says that, this is 1 times the tree height, we actually saw a loss. But just so if you took the height of the tree times 2, then that would be how high your tree is. And then we had the 3 and 4. And so the height of the tree impacted how much crop yield we got. So that was kind of long and verbose. But what we want to say is, as windbreaks increased, we saw crop yields increased. Okay, there was a law of diminishing return. So as they started to get higher and higher, we didn't see necessarily a continued increase in that crop yield, only up to about that 7, 8 height in corn or 5 in soybeans. But we can't say, well, why? How does that work? What's the justification? That's the solution part. So, Ms. Shapiro talked about that earlier. Because trees block wind, and wind is a major factor of soil erosion, the use of windbreaks means that less soil is eroded away. It means more nutrients are available for plants. It also probably does less damage to the crops themselves, the wind, and therefore crops are able to grow more. Okay. So this says, as the height of the windbreak tree increases, there is more protection from the wind, which causes soil erosion. The wind causes the soil erosion. If soil erosion is prevented, crops will see increased yield because the soil contains nutrients for growing crops. Pretty straightforward on that one. This graph was a little bit trickier, but I think once we sat down and looked at it, we were able to get it. Okay, here's our last one. So this one says, make a claim about the availability of fresh drinking water in North America. So first thing, what are the countries in North America? I'm gonna look. Tokyo, no go. New Delhi, that's in India, nope. Mexico City, yes. Sao Paulo, that's in Brazil. New York, yes. Los Angeles, yes. Chennai, that's in India. Okay, so we have 3 cities. Don't forget that Mexico City is still in North America. So make a claim about the availability of fresh water in North America. So we would just say that you could make a couple of statements here. New York has less water stress. Their water stress is low. And LA's water stress is high. How did I know that? So now let's take a look. I don't really have an x-axis here. I kind of have a y-axis. So my y-axis is low, medium to high, high, medium, high. But here my x-axis is actually on top. So this is how many million people there are. So New York has just slightly less than 20 million. LA is probably just less than 15 million. Tokyo's got over 30 million people, okay? So what we want to do is, all right, so I can say, this is how many people, this is how much water stress they're on. How did I know water stress? Oh, it tells me that in the title. Water stress levels of urban areas. So maybe my claim is that New York experiences low water stress, Mexico City and LA experience extremely high water stress. That's it. Your claim is just a statement about the graph. It doesn't even really need to include numbers. Evidence is numbers, but your claim is just a statement about the trends. Next, it says, given Los Angeles's data on the figure, propose 2 solutions to their water stress problem. So remember, first we have to understand, okay, LA's got a water stress. Now I need to figure out what are some solutions to their problems, okay? And that's where the APES content is going to come in. So if we look, we already said this, LA has extremely high water stress levels, New York has low, Mexico City has water stress levels, but contains less water stress, less people than LA, but contains less people than LA that experience water stress. Okay. And then we could say that given Los Angeles's data, I'm just gonna move this. So given LA's data on the figure, propose 2 solutions. So any type of water conservation could be accepted here. Maybe you're collecting rain in rain buckets. You're encouraging people with shorter showers through an education programs. You don't let people irrigate your lawns, right? I'm from Texas. Our students know all those things because we're constantly in drought. You can't wash your car. You can't fill up your pool. You can't have a fountain. You can only water your lawns on Tuesdays and Thursdays or Mondays and Wednesdays. So all of those kind of practices. Maybe they require that you put in an improved irrigation practice. So you move from a farrow irrigation to a drip irrigation. Maybe they're encouraging and giving tax breaks to people that buy super efficient washers and dryers or dishwashers, okay? Maybe people that have over a specific amount, they're gonna tax them, or they'll subsidize if you're under a specific amount, okay? Remember, how do you get people to do things? You educate them, you tax things you don't like, you subsidize things you do like. And so in this way, we see these are all different ways that we can get people to do stuff. So here I had to take data from the graph. I had to understand what the graph was telling me, and then I had to propose a solution for the problem that was depicted here. All right, so this very last part, I'm just asking you to evaluate yourself. How do you feel? What do you think your next steps should be? Should you move on? Should you move on? Should you go on to something else, or should you backtrack? So I encourage you to think a little bit. I hope this was helpful for you. If you have any questions, I encourage you to talk to your teacher or to reach out, and hope you'll see you in some of my other videos. I know you guys are going to do great on your AP exam. Write me a little note. Hey, reader, I hope you're having a great day.